Hi, everyone. Good evening. Welcome. My name's Mark, and on behalf of Book Soup, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us for our virtual event with Colm Tóibín, presenting his new poetry collection, Vinegar Hill. For regular updates on upcoming events, please feel free to subscribe to our email newsletter. This evening's virtual event will end with a Q&A. To submit a question, please use the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen. If you see a question on the list that you'd like for our speakers to answer, please click the like button. We'll try to answer as many questions as time will allow. Also, consider supporting our bookstore and the author's work by purchasing a copy of today's featured book, Vinegar Hill. Just click on the green purchase button directly below the viewer screen. This link will redirect you to our website where you can continue your checkout process uninterrupted. Now, a few words about our featured guest. Colm Tóibín is an Irish novelist, essayist, playwright, and poet. He's currently the Irene and Sidney B. Silverman Professor of the Humanities at Columbia University. He's been shortlisted 3 times for the Booker Prize and has won the Los Angeles Times Novel of the Year, the Costa Novel of the Year, the Stonewall Book Award, the Lambda Literary Award, and the Irish Pen Award for his contribution to Irish literature. He's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Letters and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and is a vice president of the Royal Society of Literature. Without further ado, I'm going to turn the camera over to Colm, so sit back, relax, and enjoy the reading, everyone.
Thanks very much, Mark. I'm not really a poet. This is my first book of poems, and I'm going to be 67 next month, so it's a bit late to start. I started very young. I was 12 when I started writing poems. In my house, when you were 12, you went to what's called secondary school in Ireland, and you were meant to study every evening. And I didn't really care so much about that. But what I began to do when I was in the room on my own, in all the silence, was I began to write poems. And I didn't tell anyone for a while, and I kept going with them. I found this magazine run by the Capuchin Order, which had poems by teenagers. It had your age in brackets after. And I thought I'd send them some poems, and they wrote back, and they were very polite and said they would take 1 or 2 of them. And they continued to do this for a while until my uncle was in a sort of club place where there were a lot of magazines, and he was flicking through magazines, and he saw some poems with someone of my name, with my age, and he brought them up to the house, and there was a big inquiry as to, did you write these poems? And I said I did. And there was a sort of worry about it because some of the poems were quite melancholy or had images that were strange or obscure. Anyway, I kept going with it, and I wrote poems. I should say that the Capuchins, in all their glory, were very good archivists, and they wrote to me a while ago to say that they have everything I sent them. I mean, I'm talking about 1967, 68. They have everything I sent them. They kept it all, and it's in an archive, and anyone can go and look at it. So I just recommend you not to do that, because it's been very embarrassing for me seeing these teenage poems. Anyway, I went to university and I wrote poems there. It was different though, because there were other people writing poems, which there hadn't been before. I was the only person doing that. In a way, I was addicted to poetry in the same way as other people were to sport or to film stars or something. I knew the names of poets, and I was looking at anthologies. And so I was studying all that business like maybe people would a sports star. And in university, there were other people writing poems. The problem was that some of them were really, really much better than me. And a sort of hierarchy, which is, I think, an important aspect of the poetic world. There are all sorts of different hierarchies, and certainly I was low in the hierarchy. And when I stopped writing poems at the age of 20, nobody protested. There wasn't a big sort of mourning period. It was just another failed poet in Dublin. Dublin's, in a way, in Ireland, there's a sense that if everyone had time, they'd write a book of poems. I just happened to have had time. And so I didn't write any poems again for more than 30 years. And I didn't even think about writing poems. I continued to read poems and pay enormous attention to what was happening in poetry. And I wrote a novel called The Master, a novel about Henry James. It took a lot of revising, rewriting, studying the chapters. And I suppose I was living in print culture. I was living in print. I was living in ideas of, if anything occurred to me, I would see it as a sentence. And then the chance got, when the novel was gone, I didn't have another novel. And what I began to do, without intention was to write some short stories, which I had never been able to do before, and some poems, which is very strange. And I began to really revise the poem. So I would let a poem go any direction it wanted. And then I would cut back and add, cut back and add. And I would sometimes go every hour to look at how it was going. And I kept no drafts. I did it directly onto a word processor, each line. If something didn't please me, it just went and there was no record of it. There was a sense of almost action work that I was actually trying to perfect the poem to the extent that the only existing draft was the one that was here now, was the best one, was what I thought each time might be the final one, but never was. And a great deal of things got cut. Some of these poems were almost abstract. And they might have seemed almost abstract, I suppose. I mean, they weren't to me. I knew what they were about. I knew what the image was. There was a famous historian of Dublin called Maurice Craig, and he once said to me about the city of Dublin, something I had never noticed: watch how the city curves. It's always about to curve. If you think a street is a straight line, look at the street. It's actually doing a curve. And you know, that the river curves, the streets curve, some buildings curve. Just became interested in the word curve. And this poem, the first poem I'm going to read, is called Curves. Within the body is its own sweet sound. It starts as echo and fades fast. In the bricked up burden of bone, two notes repeat, both fierce. The city curves. The brightest will is open. I've been here for years. There are lights and wires. There is some beauty. It is almost enough. And just one more of these sort of poems that brought me back to poetry. This one here is called From the Catalan. It's not a translation from the Catalan. I just like the title, From the Catalan, as though it was a translation, but it's not. From the Catalan. It was a place we came to then, cluttered and forgiving. There were no dead. One canal, the water, fast flowing, whipped up. There was a line of trees. I will take you into the nest of self. Before the tree line, hear me out. I wish it had not come to this. Their hands like money, uncomprehending. Shelter in the vein of stone. Wisdom has strange green echoes. There was something I lost that time, over there, beyond the crowd that gathered. I ended up with about 25 of these very short poems, some of which are included in the book. But the big change came when I was on chemotherapy and I was on steroids, which have a funny way of grinding inside you all day. And they give you sometimes about an hour of pure clarity in the evening. And so in that hour of pure clarity, a few times, I wrote a new sort of poem, which had a much better sound. I mean, a much harsher sound and a much clearer sort of diction. And when I published two of these poems in an Irish magazine, an editor at Carcanet in England asked me if I had more, and so began a relationship with the editor, John McAuliffe, who was a poet. It was very important for me because he said, look, there's a possibility, there's a book here. And I thought, a book? When I was 15 and 16, that's all I dreamed about, was that I would have a book of poems. And so I began to write more. And then what happened was the pandemic. And the pandemic gave me, I was in Los Angeles, I was in my partner's house, and there were long days where we weren't going anywhere and no one was coming to the house. And we were settling down, unmasked with each other. And there was a time every day when it was quiet in the house, and anything that would occur to me, I would write down. I would let the poem go as far as it would, and then I would begin to work. The work would begin then when I had actually let the explosion, as it were, occur. Then the thing was cleaning up after the explosion, putting the rubble in order and seeing what could be done. And sometimes any small thing that occurred to me, any small thing, any memory, any experience, or even any event. Some poems were written in the white heat of a single thing. There was one moment in that September of the pandemic that I had to go back to Dublin. I'm in Dublin. This poem is called September. It's a sonnet. It's the first poem in the book. And it literally had happened on the street. And I went straight back into the house and I wrote a draft of this poem, and then I worked on it for weeks afterwards. But this is how it comes out in the end. September. The first September of the pandemic. The skies are watercolour, white and grey, and Pembroke Street is empty, and so is Leeson Street. This is the time after time. What the world will look like when the world is over, when people have been ushered into seats reserved for them in the luminous heavens. Moving towards the corner of Upper Pembroke Street and Leeson Street, an elderly man wears a mask. His walk is sprightly, his movements brisk. I catch his watery eye for a watery moment. Without stopping, all matter of fact, he says, "Someone told me you were dead." And these poems were written in Los Angeles, most of them, and revised there. And one of the earliest of these Los Angeles poems is called In Los Angeles. Who can say what he had in mind or where he was headed, the last man ever to walk a dog? Water was scarce, and the sun burnished the paintings in the Getty. About suffering, of course, they were never wrong. But none of us imagined that between two trucks on the 110, I would see Icarus crawl. His bronze smile and tanned legs hover in the mind as much else fades. I told him about the forgiveness of sins, the resurrection of souls, and life everlasting. But it was, he said, too little, too late. Lux aeternae, tantum ergo, dies irae. Even the dear old hymns would not give light its shade its dark. People moved through their houses, wondering where in the name of God they had left their phones, their glasses, their e-cigarettes, their take on what must now unfold. Any thought that occurred to me, any phrase I found, could become a poem in a certain light, at a certain time of the day, in a certain mood. I was reading something one day and I came across the phrase mysterium lunae, in Latin for the mystery of the moon. The mystery of the moon, mysterium lunae. I just went over and wrote mysterium lunae and then began to work. And I suppose what was on my mind, which is on all our minds, is the idea of things that are going to disappear in the landscape with the global warming crisis, that we're not going to have things. In other words, pieces of the landscape will go or get flooded or get washed away. And the world will shrink in certain strange ways. And so I began to imagine what would happen if under these pressures, the moon itself, the moon, simply disappeared. It wasn't going to be there anymore. That everything was going to go one by one, but the moon would go. And obviously, this is not something that scientists are particularly concerned about. But I think in a poem, you can really be concerned about something almost metaphorically, as it stands for other forms of concern. It's an extreme form. This poem is called Mysterium Lunae. Last night, I saw that the moon was empty in the sky. The stars around did what they do. They are millions of miles away or millions of years. They're totally exhausted. But the moon is blank, just a space to show where it might have been. We will tell whoever will attend that the moon used to catch light from the sun and waxed and waned, full, sickle, half moon. And the songs, Blue Moon, Song to the Moon from Rusalka, Moon River, The Dark Side of the Moon and the Melodies. It was all the rage once, the moon. It was a large step, a sad step for mankind. Soon the sun will run out of hydrogen and it will all be gone. The disappearance of the moon is just the start. I'm working day and night on my book, knowing it will be the final word on the matter. I will compose with aid from scientists a description in concise prose of the time before the bang, the gorgeous vacancy, the pre-astral soup, gravity dancing like a herring on the griddle, and the sly almostness of atoms and particles, and how long a neutron took to be certain that it was not a proton, and the war between infinity and eternity that would have gone on forever had the world oozing imminence not begun to roll with its built-in obsolescence, its sell-by date, its oomph, its ooh-la-la, its everything that is the case. It is calm here now. Waves have stopped, of course. The sea has settled down. Soon it will be a flyover state. There is nothing to compel its tides. At gatherings, they read Matthew Arnold's poem and marvel at the lines about the sea being calm tonight. What else is there? But it wasn't always calm. I can swear to that. I remember Redondo Beach and the waves high and the sun going down over the horizon. Strange, I have no memory of the moon, but it must have been there somewhere. But no matter what, you can look all you want. The moon is in the past, like analog, or the western seaboard, or the library at Alexandria, or sic transit gloria mundi, a lovely old saying, long eclipsed by more fashionable tongues that yet are speechless at the vacancy in the night sky. They're howling at the thing not there that we want back now, or at least soon. The sometimes I thought I'm not putting enough of my own life into these poems, that I need to put more in, and that a poem sometimes maybe is a thing that you never told anyone and you need to say now, and you've got to find a form for it so that it moves from being something personal held inside to something being actually communicated. And I was thinking about this, and a memory came to me, just something true, something that I'd never told anyone. And it's a short poem. It's called Gellert Bath's Spring 1990. It's autobiographical. I have not been here since I met you last, the guy said in his perfect English. We wallowed in the sulphury water. Back in his place, I learned something new. If you pour sparkling wine onto an erect cock, the bubbles stay there for a while, even if the champagne wets the floor. This means that when I kneel to suck this Hungarian's dick, to my great delight, I discover that my mouth is soon alive with bubbles. So it was sort of great writing that down, just want to find this poem. I'll be there in a second. Yeah, I mean, just things that happened in the past made their way into poems. I'll read a few more and then I'll stop. And this poem is called The Long Trick. And again, it's, I suppose, autobiographical. The Long Trick. Ingmar Bergman was still alive the time I sailed on the Estonia, past the inhabited islands beyond Stockholm, on a winter Sunday, just as the dark was descending. I dreamed that he might come and mournfully wave at us, or that I might be lucky enough to catch a glimpse of him brooding at twilight, knowing how doomed we are, all of us. This was the same Estonia that sank between Stockholm and Tallinn the following year. 852 people drowned. But tonight feels long rather than dangerous. The man sharing my cabin goes to bed early. There's a restaurant for Swedes, as there always will be, and another lesser one for Estonians with grim frankfurters and runny coleslaw. I wish I could recount some premonition that I foresaw the water rushing through the narrow corridors, waking us from our sleep, and then everything dark and people calling out in Baltic languages, and then water covering everything, eventually even the ship. But it was an ordinary night on my night, and we travelled in Tallinn, we arrived in Tallinn just as morning did. It was like that too when I went out on a boat to the Great Barrier Reef a month or so after. 2 divers had been left behind by mistake. It was simple. With everyone on deck, the man in charge had shouted, "Is everyone here?" And what could the passengers do? They shouted yes. The 2 who were missing were skilled at using oxygen sparingly. So they were still down there, investigating the deep, as the boat started its engine and chugged back to Port Douglas. How clear it must have been once they surfaced that they would be unlikely to make it back to shore. I suppose they must have shouted. Maybe they swam for a while and hoped that the boat would return for them when their absence was discovered. They must have really struggled before they died. On my trip, I was too scared to dive, not because of them, the 2 who disappeared, whose remains must be somewhere under us, but because I worried that I would come up too fast, which can be fatal. Your lungs can just explode. Instead, I snorkeled or swam with my face down in the welcoming water, looking at the different blues, made all the more vivid by the light that seeped through the surface. And then I turned to float and look at the sky that was pale and washed, as though it had been too long under water. The boat was in easy reach, so there was really nothing to worry about, nothing to suggest disaster, except the waves themselves. The swell that is unnatural even at the best of times, all highs and lows, untrustworthy, even when calm, just undulating willfulness, no conscience, and no regrets. I'll just finish with a few poems about my parents and about my family. This poem is called 2+1. I suppose it's about ideas of parents are two and then they have a child and that's +1. But it often gets more complicated. 2+1. My heart is watching and weakening, mercilessly counting the beats. It is bored, casually waiting for this to cease. My father died at 53. Vessels leaked in his brain. Then arteries weakened. He moaned in pain. My mother's eyes were grey as his were blue. Her breath rose high above the town before it sank in death. I have their 2 weak hearts in 1 weak heart. Their eyes merged in my gaze. His slow smile, her side, soft glance, oversee my days. And just before I finish, there's a poem. Well, I'll read the last poem in the book, which is a poem called Because the Night, which is again written in Los Angeles. And anyway, it's just a simple poem called Because the Night. Not sleeping, and then a night's hard sleep, waking unsure which room I am in. My old friend gone 2 years was there. Last night, sitting at a table fully himself. I know he's dead. Even in the dream, I knew this. And yet I talked to him about ordinary things, not how he died or where he is. Sometimes my mother floats in, or my brothers, less often my father, who died long before they did. And then the old room in Hat Street, or the top floor of number 2 Harcourt Terrace, where I lived years back, come as though I still keep stuff in them, who've stopped paying the rent. I must sneak in and out because someone is under orders to waylay me. Soon I will have to try and rescue books and clothes, get back the music that echoes here, especially on nights when you snore. And I move into the study and sleep in the daybed, and when I wake, I have no clue where I am, what bed this is. But I will get up and find you, alive, real, now. And the morning starts, emails, newspaper. I carry the night all day, though, a flight path, a way through. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Colm, for that beautiful reading. I'm just going to take the questions we have from the audience. Our first question is from Stephen. Colm, a good friend is a total Angelino-phile, in love with Southern California. How does your time in California affect your vision, your mood, or your writing?
There are things I love. I think the Pacific Ocean demands respect from someone Irish because the waves on the east coast of Ireland are so light, they're so gentle, the water just curls. So that you can wade out into the water without the chances ever of being knocked over. And that the waves don't even wet you much, really. And you go to the Pacific and you really think, first of all, there's something pulling at your ankles as soon as you get into it that really wants to kill you, wants to drag you out and grind you. You think, be very careful the next step you take. And you take more steps. Eventually a wave comes, it's just going to actually knock you over and sort of twirl you around. I find that very enjoyable. I find partly it's the company on the beach. It's my boyfriend's there and some good friends of his, and it's very relaxed and calm and easy. And some of them are really, really good swimmers, and some of them are good surfers. And so I'm just the nerd, as usual, the wimp. I've always been the wimp. I always will be the wimp. And with the Pacific Ocean, I am a deliberate wimp. The other things, I love the morning. the particular sort of beautiful sky and high sky and the sort of calmness of the morning. I love how things grow. I love pomegranate trees. And yeah, I love I also, what the social mix, the racial mix is just, if you're Irish, it's just wonderful, moving from one zone to another and just seeing how people eat one another's food. And, so all of that's great. And then, of course, the desert. So yeah, there's nothing to complain about in Southern California. And so, yeah, it's just pure pleasure, really.
Colm, I'm wondering also, bouncing off that question, your work has such a sense of place, whether it's Ireland, Brooklyn, or as in these poems coming out of Los Angeles. How does place affect your approach, and how does time as well, especially with this collection of poetry, since your novels are often historical?
I suppose it's partly because I'm moving between, say, New York, LA, and Dublin. I start to miss places, and I start to think about them when I'm not in them. So I certainly did. It was great writing some of the Dublin poems away from Dublin, which I don't think I could have written in Dublin. I've never written a novel set in Dublin. And I haven't written even, there's no poem in this book about New York, because I sort of don't have a proper sense of the city. I'm neither from here, nor have I spent enough time here to miss it. But I always, that long description I gave you of Los Angeles, of the things you miss, that, even getting to know things like the 110 and the different freeways and the St. Gabriel Mountains and glistening on there. And what's also amazing about Los Angeles, more than anything really, is everywhere in Ireland has had a poem written about it. Even a local poet will have written ballads about a place. I mean, where I'm from in Wexford, I mean, there like a few poets, well-known poets, have written poems about the town, or have had family roots in the town. So that Ireland has been really, the amount of poetry about the country, about different places, rivers, experiences, being a girl, being a boy, being gay, being, the whole thing. Los Angeles is not a place that is awash with poems. I mean, it isn't as though it doesn't have its Frank O'Hara. It doesn't seem to naturally have its Ferlinghetti. It doesn't have, in the same way as Dublin has its Joyce, say. Los Angeles has its films. It has Mulholland Drive. It has old Chinatown. It has all those extraordinary films, but it doesn't have a towering figure of a poet. It doesn't have a Wallace Stevens or a Walt Whitman or a Louise Glick or an Emily Dickinson. In fact, it'd be lovely if Emily had come down and seen Los Angeles. One wonders what Emily Dickinson would have made of it. But I'm just saying it's an unmuddied stream for poetry. And that's a terrific idea, the place where there really hasn't been a big movement in poetry, because it was all busy being a big movement in film.
It's fascinating. It's also such a good fit to have you talking about this for our store based out of West Hollywood. So our next question is from Frances Berry. She asks, if you compared the themes of your more recent poems to the themes of the poems you wrote as a teenager, would anything surprise you, make you laugh, make you sad?
I think what I had as a teenager was a sort of manufactured sadness, a sort of sentimentality. In other words, that the emotion exceeded its cause, and a sort of inability to revise a poem. I really didn't know. I wish there'd been a class when I was 12 that explained you must revise your poems. You can't just write one and then write another. The whole point is you write it and then it becomes like a crossword. You keep finding, associations within the words, or a better way of saying things, or a stanza that's ridiculously bad and just cut. I didn't know that at 12. I wish instead of teaching me, things have been absolutely no use to me, such as, for example, physics. They had taught me how to do this. So the poems are undisciplined, and the emotion in them is not just raw, but also false. And these poems I've allowed in. I've been very careful to say, making a test. You don't always get it right, but that nothing in the poem should be untrue. I mean untrue to the poem, that there's no feeling you should mention that has not been tested in some way by experience, and that you can say honestly, I felt this, I know this. If you don't know it, it's probably not true. Don't try it. So I think there's a very big difference, and there's a sort of also a relaxed diction in these some of these poems that I couldn't get when I was 15, 16. It was all knotted and gnarled.
Do you think your experience writing novels has helped in terms of sentence choice and syntax?
Look, writing a novel is really boring. Novelists are really boring people. I mean, avoid them in society because they're really going to tediously bore you. And the reason is, of course, that writing a novel, inspiration comes once. You get an idea or you get an opening. Then you have to spend days and then weeks and then months making it all seem right, adding verisimilitude, adding more characteristics to your character. You're just constantly involved in dull, slow work. Another year could go by and no one would notice, and there's no one demanding your novel from you. So it's a sort of an egotistical activity. And like, why? And you're really in the middle of it. You really have to be driven, and there's no instant delight in the business. It's not as though you sparkle or glitter or, enjoy yourself. You don't. And I suppose it's like playing golf in that sense. There's another 17 holes to go after the first one, much like the first hole, with a lot of just walking along and hitting the ball and being in very dull company. And so writing a poem is a different thing. It's you can actually delight yourself. You can actually suddenly get a word and you realize, if that word could be right here, I could move that up here, I could cut that and down, and you can move very fast, and it's actually quite exciting work. It's almost like, compared to playing golf, it's like playing tennis, where you have to be on your toes all the time, moving, thinking, and trying to get things in, and trying to just work out strategies, but do it fast, because if you don't do it fast, the ball will have gone by you. So I think the difference between golf and tennis is I favor tennis, I have to say, over golf.
Nikos Leverenz asks, Los Angeles is a distillation of California on that front. How can one get a sense of place in such vastness and continual motion?
Oh, you see, I always think that in the same way as it was built, I mean, Los Angeles, most of it could be unbuilt, bulldozed quite quickly, that you could raise it and just go back to what you want, which is just the trees and the growth and the hills, and that it could be depopulated just as easily. I mean, there's a sense of in the buildings. I mean, compared to, say, a European city, that it would take aerial bombing to, whereas bulldozing could be done in LA. So I feel the actual, the fact that people have been there doesn't seem to me to have made that much mark on the landscape, and that mark could be erased very quickly. In other words, I think the sky is what I'm interested in. As much as I'm interested in the freeway, I'm interested in the beauty of the sky and the quality of the light. But so I'm not interested in that much as a sort of civilization, or indeed its relationship to history. I mean, obviously that would happen over time. I'm still really surprised and delighted by it.
And finally, we'll end with Francis Barry's question. Can you explain the title of the book, Vinegar Hill?
Yeah, this on the cover of the book, there's a painting by my mother. She painted for a while, and one of the things that you would paint if you were painting in my town is you would paint Vinegar Hill, because Vinegar Hill is just above the town, and there's a place in Brooklyn called Vinegar Hill, but this has absolutely nothing to do with my book. And Vinegar Hill is important because it is the last battle of the 1798 rebellion, which was a famous rebellion in Wexford, County Wexford in Ireland, against the British. It's the thinking behind it was really based on the American Revolution and the French Revolution, except ours didn't succeed. It didn't catch fire. So the rebels foolishly went up on a hill. I don't know why they did this. They did it partly because they weren't insurgents that had studied warfare. They were idealists, or they were in some way or other seeking revenge. Whatever they were doing, they were up on the hill. The British came and surrounded the hill, and the rebels managed to get out through one gap. And in all the ballads about the rebellion, which are many, which we all learned in school, there's always a mention of Vinegar Hill, or so you sing about it. It's mythological. It's part of the sort of epic business of Irish nationalism. And it's also, of course, as far as we're concerned, it's a rock. I mean, you look at it, it's there. It's part of the town. So it's both mythological and real and natural. And at the very end of the poem, I'm trying to work out all this, to look at the clouds, look at the hill, and I'm trying to see it as rock, just a thing in nature. But the language won't let me. No matter what you do, you start thinking about the rebels, and the rebels trying to get away. And so it talks about the matter of clouds, the clouds over the hill, the small matter of clouds that make tracks over the hill in a smoke of white, as though instructed by their superiors to break camp. They change their shape, crouch down, stay still, all camouflage, dreamy, lost, with no strategy to speak of, yet resigned to the inevitable. When the wind comes for them, they will retreat. Until this time, they're surrounded by sky and can as yet envisage no way out. So the sort of imagery at the end is all about military, military defeat and surrender and attempts to get away. So no matter what you do, you end up back with the battle when you're trying to actually look at the hill as a hill.
Colm, we actually got in a couple more questions. Do you mind staying a few more minutes?
Not at all. Not at all.
Okay, great. Dorothy Abbott asks, talking about a sense of place, have you ever been to Oxford, Mississippi? And has William Faulkner been an influence on your writing?
Anyone who read As I Lay Dying in their late teens, as I did, found the book utterly fascinating, unforgettable, and not only so hilariously funny, but so appallingly gothically sad. And so from that, I read, The Sound of the Fury and Absalom, Requiem for a Nun, and but I've never gone there, and I'd really like to go. And I like the story of Bill Clinton, just trying to find out, was there anyone civilized ever in the area of the world where he was from? And realizing, yes, it was once a man called William Faulkner. And then I also love the argument that James Baldwin began to have with Faulkner over desegregation. So because Faulkner's position on desegregation was, it was less than helpful. And that's also an interesting part of him, that he was very much a white man in the South, trying to write his way out of his own prejudice or his own, but not succeeding all the time. And that interests me, the sort of ambiguities in him. So yeah, I'd love to go there. I really would.
And finally, Stephen asks, would you speak about the difference between depicting gay life today and historically? The earthiness of today and the shadows of yesterday?
Yeah. I think we're all marked, and there's nothing we can do about this, because everyone else aged 13, 14, and 15 who wasn't gay, it became so natural. They had a way of striding about the place and going to dances and knowing what they wanted. And, and if you're gay, you sort of, first of all, you wonder, why are they doing this? And you realize, because they're straight. You mean they feel about girls like I feel about them? And that's a very complicated set of feelings, because you have to keep them to yourself. No matter what liberated community you're in, there's a month at least, and at most a few years, and at most perhaps even longer, where you just don't know how to deal with this. You don't know how to name it. You want it to go away. And, that marks you no matter how liberated the world has become. And all of us know it. And we'd like it to happen less to people in the future, because it really isn't. It really is. And the prejudice that causes it is itself very damaging to the people who feel the prejudice. Because if guys feel that prejudice against gay people, you find they have many other prejudices too, and there are people to avoid. And one of the ways in which gay people have managed in the world is that they become friends with girls. And girls manage to look after us, to say to guys, that if you are nasty to him, I'm not having to do with you because you're a creep. And so we learn to navigate in a way that other people don't have to learn. And so I've been writing, there's a novel about Henry James, born in 1843, who really didn't deal with his homosexuality in any open way that left any record in his life. Obviously, there are many clues in the novels, but you have to read into them. It isn't as though they're there for you, they're presented for you. I wrote a novel about Thomas Mann called The Magician. He's born in 1875. So those 30 years have made a difference in the fact that he's in Germany. So he can write Death in Venice, but he gets married and has 6 children. And in his diaries, he keeps the whole story of his secret erotic life. So, I mean, I wrote those 2 books in a way because there's a sort of dotted line from us into the past. And it's a faint line. It's a line that disappears sometimes. But I think we have to be conscious of what history is, what history means for us. In other words, as an oppressed community, if you don't have a sense of the history of your oppression, then the chance of liberating yourself from it is sort of really less than good. So there's knowing about it. And also I found with James and with Mann, the sort of ambiguous way they had to live, the constant relationship between concealment and revelation in their work, even. The constant way in which they found metaphors for their own secrecy. Really interesting and worthy of a lot of dramatization. So, you know, it would, there are certain societies still, in fact, there are many societies still where that hiding is still being done. And then there are societies where we are now in the United States, where, I mean, it looks to me as though the Supreme Court will, in the next short time in America, do something against gay marriage. In other words, it will row back. Having done Roe versus Wade, it will go after us. And that, you know, really will be an absolute disaster because it will last for a long time. And it will open areas of prejudice that we thought we had managed to close down. And yeah, it looked as though we were free. It looked as though there was a great sort of liberation movement had led to liberation. But that may turn out in the United States not to be the case. So where I'm from, Ireland is strange because it was such a Catholic country and monolithic and really without any chance, I mean, without any chance of even being mentioned as being gay or being seen to be gay, that there was a huge invisibility, unmentionability. It was an abomination. And suddenly that changed. And, you know, the referendum we had to have a constitutional referendum on same-sex marriage. And of course, the referendum won, I think, 62 to 38. And it was a great day of liberation. And it's in the Constitution now. No one can touch it. But there's no one wants to touch it. There's no, we don't have your religious right because we didn't let those, I mean, that sort of your religious radio that was let loose for years without being opposed. In every small place, there was a lunatic talking on the radio. And people were listening to him, and we don't have those lunatics to the same extent, and so things are much easier in Ireland than they seem here. I think things are darkening here.
Sorry to end on a dour note, everyone, but that is a wrap on our presentation. Thank you again to our guest Colm and to all of you.
Thanks, Mark. Mark, and thanks for all your technical help at the beginning. Yes. You're a sort of wizard.
Sorry about that. I'm glad that we got it worked out, though.
Okay, thank you.
Thank
you very much, everybody. Thank you.
Please click the green button to purchase Colm's book from
Okay.
BookSoup. Thank you. Good night.
Okay, bye.